Okay, folks. So now we're going to move into the dinner theater portion of our program. But keep working on your lunches. So I'm Daniel Webster again, California Child Welfare Indicators Project. And so our panel for this afternoon is going to be focusing on policies and TAY outcomes. And we have two terrific presentations. The first one will be on leveraging quasi-experimental methods to evaluate foster care reform in California. And our presenter is Kate Mewson, who is a PhD candidate in economics at Columbia. So yeah, let's hear it for NYC. Who loves New York? Dun, 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 dun. Anyway, she's an NSF graduate research fellow. Her research lies in the intersection of health and labor economics with a focus on child health and welfare. Her current work with QUIP leverages new linked administrative data and quasi-experimental research methods to evaluate the effects of policy. And after her, we'll have Lindsay Palmer is going to make a presentation on understanding the nature of adolescent neglect and the role of child protection system. And Lindsay is an assistant professor at the University of Utah's College of Social Work. Her research seeks to understand the nature, extent, and impact of CPS involvement on the stability and well-being of vulnerable children, with a particular focus on allegations of child neglect. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kate.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm excited to talk to you about some new work. I'm calling this Fostering a Gentler Flight from the Nest, Effects of Foster Care Reform on Labor Market Outcomes. In this study, I'm going to be using some new methods from the economics and statistics literature in order to try to isolate the causal effect of extended foster care on the labor market outcomes of youth transitioning out of foster care and into young adulthood. So this is a very different audience than what I usually give a talk to, so I appreciate that we're in a room full of experts here when it comes to transition age youth policy, but just to make sure everyone's on the same page, I want to start by just giving a quick history of extended foster care in California. To start off with, prior to the introduction of extended foster care in 2012, 4,000 to 5,000 children aged out of foster care every year in California at age 18. And a wealth of research from the social work literature, much from individuals in this room, has demonstrated how youth aging out of foster care can experience high rates of poverty, homelessness, and incarceration. In response to that knowledge, the National Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act was signed in 2008, which gave states the option to extend foster care up to the age of 21 and receive federal funding to do so. And California was an early and enthusiastic adopter of extended foster care with its own California Fostering Connections to Success Act, otherwise known as AB 12, which was signed in September of 2010, extending foster care up to age 21 over the course of 3 years. Foster care eligibility was extended up to age 19 in 2012, up to age 20 in 2013, and finally up to age 21 in 2014. So the research questions that I'm answering today are threefold. The first is, what is the effect of extended foster care on college enrollment and earnings for former foster youth? The second is, how do these effects vary by race and gender? And what underlying factors might explain differing effects that we see for different demographic groups? And before I begin, I want to give two caveats. The first is that the services and placement types available to youth transitioning out of care evolved as AB 12 was implemented, as we have seen in some of the presentations earlier today. So today I'm focusing on the early years of extended foster care, since these are the youth that we can observe outcomes in their late 20s for. So this is the birth cohorts 1991 through 1996. And the second, ironically, I know we're in LA today, but since LA has had a different history of extended foster care than the rest of the state, most of these analyses will be excluding LA, although I can say that results actually look quite similar even with the inclusion of LA County. To give you a preview of my findings, I find that each additional year of extended foster care increases the likelihood that youth enroll in two-year college by 2.9 percentage points, which is a 6.2 increase from the mean enrollment rate of 47% in two-year college among this population. Each additional year of extended foster care increases earnings at 24 and 25 by 4.9%. But these effects are mostly driven by improved outcomes specifically of non-Hispanic white men who experience much larger effects of extended foster care than other groups of transition-age youth. To start with, I want to first establish the fact that probably most people in this room know, which is that Assembly Bill 12 was incredibly successful in its first objective of increasing time in foster care for transition-age youth. Here, I'm showing the density plot of the exit age from foster care for youth who are in care on their 16th birthday for two different cohorts. In red, I'm showing you the exit ages for the birth cohort born in 1992, which was the last birth cohort to not be eligible for extended foster care under AB 12. And in blue, I'm showing you the distribution for the birth cohort born in 1994, which was the first cohort to have full eligibility for extended foster care under AB 12. And what I want you to take away from these plots are two things. First, for looking at the red line, what this is showing with that heaping at age 18 is that prior to the implementation of AB 12, 18 was a binding threshold for many youth, with most youth who are in care after their 16th birthday exiting basically around age 18, with very little youth exiting after, although there was some discretion. The second thing I want you to see is that for the blue cohort, the 1994 birth cohort, there is this huge shift in the distribution where suddenly age 21, the new threshold, becomes the new most common exit age for youth who are still in care on their 16th birthday. There's some youth who are still, exiting at age 18. Extended foster care is optional, but clearly there was an effective shift in terms of the time spent in care for these youth. Now, I could speak for an hour on the empirical methods here, but I will not bore you with that, although I would love to speak with anyone offline about the nitty-gritty of the statistics here. But to give you a brief overview of my empirical methods, my objective here is to actually estimate the causal effect of extended foster care. And I know you've all heard 1,000 times that causation does not equal correlation, and that's very much so true. And so that's why I need to account for certain facts, for a few different factors in building a statistical model that actually can try to tease out that causality under certain assumptions. And the three important issues that I need to account for are first, that extended foster care is optional. Those who choose to be in extended foster care are going to be different than youth who choose not to be in extended foster care. The second issue is that characteristics of youth in care are changing over time. So we want to be able to account for differences for youth as different birth cohorts come through the system. And finally, we want to know the effects of extended foster care take-up and not just eligibility for extended foster care. And the reason why we want to know this is for two reasons. First is that there's been many policy discussions about how to increase take-up of extended foster care for youth, and so that's a really important policy parameter. The second issue is that for certain demographics, what I'm going to show is that the effects of extended foster care were actually quite small. And what I want to be able to show here is that the effects actually were small rather than just the true effects being washed out by differences across groups in take-up of extended foster care. So in order to do this, I implement a two-stage statistical model, which in the first stage, I estimate the increase in extended foster care use that's created by this policy experiment of Assembly Bill 12. Here, I'm actually going to be considering two different groups of youth, both before and after the implementation of the policy, where I compare early leavers, youth who are exiting care before age 17, to youth who are at risk of aging out, youth who are still in care at age 17. And these two groups are going to differ from each other in a lot of really important ways that are going to determine labor market outcomes and education, but I can provide evidence that their trajectories, specifically with respect to time in foster care, would have remained similar in absence of Assembly Bill 12. And that's kind of the key assumption there in that first part of the model. Next, I'm able to estimate the effect of additional years of care created by Assembly Bill 12 on labor market outcomes using that increase in time in care that I've estimated from the first stage of the statistical model. My first finding I want to share with you is that extended care increases two-year college enrollment, but it does so unequally. In this graph, I'm showing you the percentage point increase in two-year college enrollment from one additional year of care by gender and by race. In green, I'm showing you the effect for all youth. In blue, I'm showing you the effect for non-Hispanic white men and for non-Hispanic white women. And in yellow, I'm showing you the effect for men of color and for women of color, where the bars that you see on each of the bars, the lines, basically are an indication of statistical uncertainty. And what you should take away from this figure is that each additional year of extended foster care increases the likelihood that youth enroll in two-year college by 2.9 percentage points, which is 6.2% of the mean enrollment rate. But for non-Hispanic white men, the enrollment in two-year college increases by 7.1 percentage points, which is a full 16.8% of the mean. So this is a much larger effect. There's one thing I want you to note here, or two things I want you to note here. The first is that each of these comparisons where I'm doing the treatment effects by these different groups are comparing apples to apples in the sense that I'm comparing non-Hispanic white men who are receiving care to those who are not. So it's within these groups. The second thing I want to point out is that in terms of the number of youth that are in each of these buckets, there are actually far fewer non-Hispanic white men than there are men or women of color. And so in theory, I should actually be able to more easily detect an effect for men of color, for women of color, than I would be for non-Hispanic white men. So the differences you see here are not driven by sample size. Next, I look at some additional subgroups for youth of color, and I see a very similar pattern. Here, what I'm showing you is the percentage point increase in two-year college enrollment from one additional year of care, first in purple for non-Black Hispanic youth, for men and for women, and then in red for non-Hispanic Black youth, first for men and for women. And the patterns generally look pretty similar. The one thing to note, though, is that there actually is this very noisy but positive effect for non-Black Hispanic men. And so in my research, I'm trying to ascertain why non-Hispanic white men and non-Black Hispanic men look similar in terms of their treatment effects with respect to college. This will look different, though, when I turn to earnings. The second effect that I want to talk about is that extended care has little to no effect on 2 to 4 year college completion. It is very effective at getting youth to enroll in college, but not necessarily to complete it. Here I'm showing the percentage point increase in 2 or 4 year college completion from one additional year of care, again, for all youth in green, for non-Hispanic white men and non-Hispanic white women in blue, and for men of color and women of color in yellow. And overall, there is no statistically significant effect of additional care for the college completion rates of all youth. I do see a marginally significant effect on the college completion for non-Hispanic white men, but for other groups, it is either noisy or estimated to be close to zero. Again, looking in narrower ethnic categories, disaggregating by non-Black Hispanic youth and non-Hispanic Black youth, both by gender, the effects are even more clearly pronounced as zero effects. Turning to later down the line, when we look at labor market outcomes at age 24 and 25, we see a very similar pattern. We see that extended foster care increases wages at 24 and 25, but it does so unequally. Here I'm showing the percentage increase in wages at age 24 and 25 from an additional year of care, first in green for all youth, then for non-Hispanic white men and non-Hispanic white women in blue, and finally for women of color and men of color in yellow. And what I see here is that each additional year of extended foster care increases earnings at 24 and 25 by 4.9%, and for non-Hispanic white men, earnings increase by a whopping 16.6%. Turning again to some of these narrower ethnic categories within youth of color, an interesting pattern emerges in that while we still see no effect of extended foster care on the wages for non-Black Hispanic youth and non-Hispanic Black men, there actually does seem to be some improvements in the wages for non-Hispanic Black women, although I have less precision to be able to give you an estimate there. Turning to effects on formal employment, so whether or not they were employed at all at age 24 and 25, things look very similar, that we see these increases for all youth and larger increases specifically for non-Hispanic white men and for non-Hispanic Black women. A natural question you might ask is why non-Hispanic white men, and factors that you might think of as probation history, placement in congregate care, and use of kin care do not seem to be the reason that non-Hispanic white men benefit more from care. There are two factors that do seem to matter, both the presence of neuropsychological disabilities and geography. And I'll talk about these in the next couple slides, but again, these don't explain why non-Hispanic white men benefit the most. And my ongoing work continues to explore mechanisms, and that's where I'm really excited to be able to have conversations with all of you in this room as I continue that work. So here what I do is that I am looking at the treatment effects by whether or not youth are recorded as having a neuropsychological condition in the administrative data. And I should give the caveat of this field in the data is not always well populated, and so there may be some imprecision in terms of who is identified as having these conditions. And the second thing I want to say is that I'm using a very broad definition of neuropsychological conditions that spans both things like anxiety and depression, but also learning disorders and ADHD. And what I find here is that the treatment effects of extended foster care on college enrollment are actually suggestively higher for youth with neuropsychological conditions, whereas the treatment effects of extended foster care on wages are zero for youth with neuropsychological conditions and entirely driven by youth without them. And so the fact that, one, there's these somewhat contradictory results, and second, that it is actually white men who have more high rates of neuropsychological conditions in the data suggests that this, again, cannot be explanatory. As you all know, there's a lot of racial segregation in California as well, and geography does seem to matter for the treatment of extended foster care, but again, it's not explaining the non-Hispanic white men effect. What I'm showing here is a map of California by county, where I've categorized counties according to whether they're a non-metro county in dark blue, through small metro area, to medium metro area, to big metro area, where white people are disproportionately located in non-metro areas. And what I do see is that there do seem to be larger effects on wages from extended care, specifically in more suburban areas, but there isn't necessarily a huge non-metro rural white effect that I'm picking up. So geography matters, but I still have to figure out what those mechanisms underlying the geography are. To give a recap of my results, I find that each additional year of extended foster care increases the likelihood that youth enroll in two-year college, but effects for non-Hispanic white men are 2.7 times the size for youth overall. There's no detectable effect of extended foster care on 2- or 4-year college college completion, but there is suggestive evidence that has an effect for non-Hispanic white men, and each additional year of foster care increases earnings at 24 and 25, but the effects for non-Hispanic white men are 3.4 times the size of the effect for youth overall. To conclude, extended foster care improved outcomes for youth aging out of care, but overall effects mask important differences by race and gender. Disability and geography are both clearly important, but further work is needed to understand what are the mechanisms underlying differential effects. And at the end of the day, despite improvements, educational attainment and earnings remain low for former foster youth, so further work is needed to unpack the factors behind the effects found and to improve foster care policy for all youth. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kate. That was a lot of information, and of course we'll be distributing. I'm sure we'll be distributing all the PowerPoints and everything else following the presentation today. So there's a lot to absorb there. So I was furiously scribbling notes myself, but and we can also we'll have questions after Dr. Palmer goes, and then of course there'll be ample time to connect with us about some of the findings later. So with that, I'll turn to Dr. Lindsay Palmer to talk about understanding the nature of adolescent neglect and the role of child protection system. Lindsay?
All right. Oh, okay. Sorry.
Sorry, I had an appendix.
That's okay. Economist. Oh. Oh, I went too far. How do I go back? Oh.
It's still not there. There you are.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So I'm actually going to spend the next 15 minutes and kind of take us upstream a little bit and look at what are the allegations that are coming to the attention of the child protection system when an adolescent is reported for neglect. All right, so a quick thank you to our partners and collaborators, but also noting that the results are solely myself and those of my co-authors and don't reflect the opinion of any of these agencies. All right, so each year in California, CPS investigates over 400,000 allegations of child maltreatment. More than a quarter of these referrals are going to involve an adolescent. About 1 in 10 are going to concern an older adolescent, so a child that's 16, 17 years old and getting ready to transition to early adulthood. It's pretty well known that neglect is a documented factor in the vast majority of reports, substantiations, and placements. Approximately 70% of investigations will include allegations of neglect, 75% of substantiations, and upwards of 62% of removals. So very common. All right, a basic definition of neglect is the failure of a parent or caregiver to meet a child's basic needs such that a child's health or safety is threatened. States' civil statutes commonly define these basic needs as food, clothing, shelter, medical care, or supervision. But it's rarely possible for us to be able to parse out what those individual neglect circumstances are because of the way that the data is collected and stored. And so most agencies have these details in the narrative data, or they might have some subcategories, which oftentimes can be super broad and vague. So to date, the vast majority of research on neglect still uses this singular construct called neglect. All right, so for the context of this study, when I say neglect, I will be referring to 3 types of maltreatment: general neglect, severe neglect, and caretaker absence or incapacity. General neglect is the negligent failure of a person having the care or custody of a child to provide adequate food, clothing, shelter, medical care, or supervision where no physical injury to the child has occurred. Severe neglect is when the neglect ends with severe malnutrition or non-organic failure to thrive. And caretaker absence or incapacity means the temporary or permanent inability of the child's parent to provide care or supervision for the child. Okay, so what do we know about what is being referred to Child Protective Services under the umbrella of neglect? A study that we did a couple years ago that looked at case narratives in the state of California for allegations of neglect found that substance use, mental illness, domestic violence, and failure to protect from abuse were the most common concerns reported under that umbrella of neglect and accounted for 75% of all neglect investigations. We did a subsequent study using Pennsylvania data that really had similar findings to California, but we were able to illustrate some differences based on the child's age, right? You can imagine that neglect of an infant is going to look quite different than neglect of a 17-year-old. But because of the limitations in the Pennsylvania data, we really weren't able to go much deeper than to say that adolescents are more likely to come to the attention of the system for behavioral health concerns. So we're certainly left with some unanswered questions around why or what community members are concerned about, when calling Child Protective Services for neglect. Okay, so what do we know about adolescents and maltreatment? Adolescents who, I can barely read my own slide. Adolescents who experience maltreatment experience greater difficulties transitioning into adulthood, although maltreatment at any age it's been found that adolescents, if you experience maltreatment during adolescence, it's more strongly linked with adverse life outcomes than maltreatment that is experienced earlier in life. Yet reports of maltreatment for adolescents are much less likely to be substantiated and much less likely to receive services from the child protective system. And I don't think that we really know the reasons why, but one of those reasons might be that the concerns that are coming to the attention of the system aren't meeting those statutory definitions of neglect. All right, so the objective of this study is really just to try to understand what those concerns are that are being reported to the system. We had 3 questions. The first was, what are the most common concerns for adolescents that are being reported under neglect? The second was, what are the caregiver risk factors present in CPS reports classified as neglect? And then the third is, in what proportion of reports was a referral for community-based services made? So we were randomly selected 1,000 referrals that were made from 2017 to 2019 that had an adolescent on the referral with an allegation of neglect. And we used both the screener narrative, so what the reporter is saying when they call into the hotline, and the investigative narrative, so what the social worker is writing down during their investigation. And we were lucky enough to be able to collaborate with Dr. Zukaya on this content analysis, who has experience working at DCFS and navigating the DCFS portal. All right, so overall concerns for the adolescent, 41% of referrals for adolescent neglect had to do with the adolescent's behavioral health, 30% had to do with lack of protection from physical or sexual abuse, 30% were concerns related to the adolescent's mental health, 22% were due to lack of adequate supervision, and 17% were related to adolescents with unmet material needs. And examples of inadequate supervision for these adolescents were examples like parents not allowing the child back in the home, quote unquote being kicked out, or parents leaving for extended amounts of time, so days or weeks. All right, so this graph illustrates that older adolescents, so those 16 and 17-year-olds, were more likely to be referred for behavioral or health concerns compared to the younger adolescents. And the rest of the categories were more or less the same. For those 41% of adolescents who were reported due to concerns related to their behavior, most frequently it was for adolescent substance use or alcohol use, followed by defying authority or rule breaking, and then by truancy. And you can see here that older adolescents were much more likely to be reported to CPS for alcohol or drug use. Okay, so for those 17% of adolescents that had a concern documented on their referral related to an unmet material need, there were pretty big differences by age. In general, younger adolescents were much more likely to have a concern for an unmet material need reported, and that stayed true for all the subcategories with the exception of being unhoused, which older adolescents were much more likely than younger adolescents to have a concern related to themselves being unhoused. Okay. For the parental or household risk, 29% noted a concern related to the parent's substance use or alcohol use. About 1 in 4 had co-occurring physical or sexual abuse allegations, and then about 17% noted domestic violence. All right, so the only difference by age was that younger adolescents were much more likely to have a documented concern related to parental alcohol or drug use compared to the older adolescents. And this really maps on to a lot of the other neglect studies that we've been doing where you see substances are overwhelmingly present for the youngest kids, particularly for infants, but then kind of has a declining presence as children age. Okay, so this table illustrates the overlap between the concern for the child and that parental or household risk. So how you would read this is if you look at that behavioral health concern, if a child had a behavioral health concern reported, 23% of those referrals also noted parental alcohol or substance use. 6% also noted parental mental illness. 24% also had co-occurring physical or sexual abuse allegations, and 10% had co-occurring domestic violence. And how you look at that yellow column over there is this tells you for each concern for the child listed, how frequently did that concern occur alone, so with no parental or household risk noted or documented with it. And this is a percentage of all of the adolescent neglect referrals. So 14% of all referrals for adolescent neglect had to do with behavioral health concern with no other listed concerns or risks. Okay. And then on the kind of lower end, 5% of all referrals had to do with an unmet material need with no other kind of co-occurring risk. Okay, so overall, 55% of all adolescent referrals had to do with either the child's behavioral health or mental health, and 33% of referrals included a documented concern related to the parent's mental or behavioral health. And so that means that 73% of all of the referrals were related to either the child or the parent's mental or behavioral health. Okay, so what CPS interventions are these adolescents receiving? Overall, about 6% had a case opened and less than 3% were removed, with younger adolescents being much more likely to have a case opened. And foster care in general was rare for these adolescents, but older kids were slightly more likely to enter placement. Okay, so based on what was documented in the notes, overall it looks like about 42% of referrals received a referral to community-based services. And about 5% of these families declined the service, 13% families were already receiving services. So overall, it looked like about half of these adolescent referrals, there was no services offered, and there was no indication that adolescents were already in services. Okay, so differences by county in terms of referrals for services. And I want to make sure that I note here that this could reflect a difference in actual community-based referrals that were made, or this could simply reflect a difference in the documentation of those referrals. But what we saw in the data is that the more urban counties, particularly Los Angeles, had a much higher proportion of families receiving a community-based service referral compared to those more rural counties. Okay, we also wanted to look at these adolescents' past history with Child Protective Services and found that most, 64%, had one or more past referrals. About 1 in 5 had a past case, and 1 in 10 had experienced a past removal. So past involvement was really common for these adolescents. Okay, so the takeaways. The referrals for adolescents reported to neglect are really overwhelmingly have to do with mental and behavioral health, right? 55% of the concerns for the adolescent was their own mental or behavioral health, and 3 out of 4 referrals were either the parents or the child's mental or behavioral health. But only about 6% of these referrals ended up with a case opened, and less than half were referred for a community-based service. And even for those 40% of families that were referred for a community-based service, we know from some of the other studies that we've been doing in LA County on service uptake and engagement in community-based services, that only about 1/3 of these families are going to say yes to the referral, and then half will engage and kind of follow through with those services. So we're really talking about less than 10% getting really connected with some services. And then the third takeaway is that the concerns reported and being captured as neglect don't necessarily match on to what we think neglect is, particularly given that the definitions of neglect predominantly have to do with lack of food, lack of clothing, lack of shelter, and lack of supervisions, when those things don't seem to be what's driving these referrals. I'm going to move because I'm running out of time. And last, the implication. So I think the results really reinforce that cross-system strategies are needed to address the needs of the adolescents being reported to Child Protective Services under this construct of neglect. But we need effective interventions for adolescents. And right now it seems like there is a serious lack of quality and accessible mental health, and particularly substance abuse treatment providers, particularly for families and adolescents receiving Medicaid or who are uninsured. And it really reinforces that our system as it currently is may be ill-equipped to prevent or to treat these kind of proximal contributors to neglect allegations. I hate to leave a presentation with questions, but I'm going to leave this presentation with 2 questions. And I think what comes up for me after looking through all of these results is that we see all these reports coming in related to the adolescent's mental and behavioral health. So clearly, community members are concerned. They see a child in crisis, and they're reporting it to Child Protective Services. And it makes me wonder if they're calling Child Protective Services because there is no alternative, right? There's nowhere else for them to be able to call, to be able to try to get this child connected with services. And then that leads to the last question, which is, what is the role or responsibility of Child Protective Services in these circumstances? When a report comes in and it has to do with, a severe behavioral or mental health crisis or concern, particularly when that might have been driven by past maltreatment experiences, but where maybe on this current referral there's not a noted parental or household risk, what's their responsibility in those circumstances?
Thank you, Lindsay and Kate. So do we have some questions from the audience for our panelists? We have a couple.
Hi, I have a question for Kate. Oh, there she is. Okay. I was wondering if in your matching of the groups you considered parenthood. I was just wondering about that, as you mentioned, kind of non-Hispanic white men having kind of the largest effects. They are also the group that have the least rates of parenthood, and I wonder if some of that might drive the effect.
It's an interesting question. I think I should start with a quick clarification, and then I can move on to addressing your question more directly. So my methodological approach doesn't actually directly involve a matching. It's more of an estimation of trajectories over time that include comparisons within similar groups. So there isn't necessarily a match per se, but the issue of parenting and parenthood is definitely something that could be a factor here, and something that I really hope to explore more, especially in the eventuality that birth certificates become linkable. One thing to consider, though, in terms of what role parenting would have here is that since the comparisons are within groups, that you're comparing, when I do the different analyses, I'm comparing Hispanic women who have access to extended foster care with Hispanic women who do not have access to extended foster care and are even taking up that extended foster care. The lack of treatment effect would imply that basically extended foster care as a package of treatment is ineffective in helping parenting youth. And so, which is a slightly different implication necessarily than parenting driving the effect, if that makes sense. And so I think it could definitely be a mechanism, but it begs the question, if you're providing this resource, what is the limitation where it's just not able to create that effect? And with the second caveat of, here I'm only looking at college and earnings. There's a whole breadth of outcomes that reflect well-being, even economic well-being, that I'm really not assessing. And so there could be positive effects for pregnant and parenting youth that are just not going to be reflected either in college enrollment or earnings at 24 and 25. There could be things like better health outcomes for their children, better well-being, better psychological health, less stress. There's a whole sorts of ways in which having that resource could help that, as of now, I'm just not able to speak to. So I want to keep that in mind as well.
Thank you both for this presentation. My question is for Dr. Palmer. Just wondering about, there's a lot of counties and states that are looking at mandated supporting versus mandated reporting. So I'm just wondering if you looked at or plan to look at referral source and reporting party and sort of what role or effect that has on the questions that you're asking and looking to answer.
Yes, so we do plan on looking at that in this study. The kind of beast of this study was going through the 1,000 case notes and narratives, and so we were kind of in a race at the end to pull this together. But we certainly are going to look at the reporting source. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi again. Well, I'll still reintroduce myself. My name is Erin Carrison. I'm from the School of Social Welfare at UC Berkeley, and my question is actually for you, please, Kate, or maybe a suggestion. So forgive me, I didn't catch your setup for your presentation, so I don't know what literatures you've grounded this in, if at all, but I would be remiss if we did not make sure, given these findings, that we understood the durability of privilege for cis white men. Whatever's happening with these effects, I'm like, yeah, a cis white man in a labor market? Like, what are we doing? And especially if untethered, right, if you're not a parent. Mm-hmm. So again, I'm trained in sociology and criminology. I don't know what your setup was. But that's a big deal. Please don't neglect that. And then related to the idea of the geographical sort of variation that you saw as well with labor market outcomes or college education, finishing it and then getting a job and earnings, I would really encourage you to do some sort of analysis. It doesn't even have to be spatial, but something where you're looking either at the census tract or county level at structural racism, structural inequality on the economic foundations as well as sexism, especially for the labor market. A queer, disabled mother is just gonna have a really different experience in college and then subsequently in work. We cannot lose that piece. And that's something that I think is forgotten with marginalized white people, understanding that they still have white privilege. We as scientists have got to articulate that really, really clearly. So I would definitely consider, or ask you to consider that in the front end, whatever literature, you're framing any of this off of. And then for your geographical question, look at where racism plays out on the ground. Look at where sexism plays out on the ground. What kinds of economic and employment opportunities are even available to folks? Thank you so much for your work.
Thank you. Your point is very well taken. Actually, a friend of mine sent me that there was a new data resource provided of I think it might have actually been at the tract level, kind of measuring different aspects of structural racism that now exists, and that's one of my first first things on my to-do list in terms of new analysis. So and your point is, again, well taken, that all of these results could be explained by essentially, even with the leg up, it's not helpful. That if as part of being in extended foster care, you're supposed to be in school or working, but you're just not able to get a job because of discrimination, that would very much so explain potential differences in terms of the treatment effect of having that care. So that definitely makes sense. I do want to make one point, though, in terms of some of these effects, which is that within the context of this sample, there's actually some somewhat surprising results that pop out just when you look at the means here, which is that when it comes to things like earnings and college enrollment, non-Hispanic white men actually do quite poor on those outcomes relative to more marginalized groups. And so there is a broader question of what sorts of non-Hispanic white men are those who are put into foster care in the first place. And so, there's some literature suggesting, for example, that when it comes to whether or not a child who's investigated actually gets put into care, that white parents are often given the benefit of the doubt, and then they need to have repeat referrals to Child Protective Services in order for the child to actually enter foster care. And so when you think about the marginal child who is entering foster care, who's white, their background is probably going to be very different than compared to the average white person, or even the average disadvantaged white person when you compare the average black person who has been put into foster care compared to the average black person who's disadvantaged in other ways. And so that's kind of another consideration in terms of how to think about or at least how I'm thinking about kind of the complexity of all these systems interacting with each other. That structural racism is absolutely somewhere underlying this, but the question is what stage of the system is the area in which the structural racism matters the most, because depending on where in the system you get the biggest bite, that has the from my perspective, I think that has implications for policy, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
I think I disagree, but yes, I understood you.
Okay.
Yes, that makes sense. Thank you.
And I'd love to discuss this more.
Thank you. This question is for Dr. Palmer. In regards to some of the conversation that has been uplifted right now, do you have any insight on the process of analyzing a referral? Is that done in cohort? I guess what I'm getting at is are you aware of any factors that are in place to limit bias? And is there any demographic findings that stand out to you in regards to referrals and removals?
So we didn't look super closely at the case openings and the referrals because the numbers ended up being so small. We did look at some racial and ethnic differences by the concern for the child and the household risks. There weren't a whole lot of differences other than white children or white adolescents were more likely to have a documented concern related to parental alcohol or substance use. And Hispanic adolescents were more likely to have a documented concern related to domestic violence. But these weren't like hugely different. And I think we certainly considered this study to be very exploratory. We just kind of went into the data with a few different categories that we knew from the previous literature were gonna pop up pretty consistently, but we didn't necessarily have like a set structure of how we were looking at the data. We just asked Dr. Zukaya to kind of go through and basically kind of count when these things were popping up, and then make notes when other things were. So we are looking at other people's, I think Dr. Park said it earlier, that we're just using, we didn't create the data, we're just using the data, so we're very, very limited in terms of just having to go off of what that social worker said, just having to go off of what that reporting caller said, and we don't really have any other information other than that to.
Yeah, that makes sense. In analyzing that data, did you see that the referrals were mainly in the hands of one person, or?
We haven't looked at, the referral source yet, but that's definitely our next step to look at, to see if there are differences by, teachers reporting versus doctors reporting versus police officers and whatnot.
Okay, thank you.
This will be the last question. Yes, last question.
Thanks. This is for Dr. Palmer. And I really appreciate the research on that population of young people, especially. I'm curious as to whether or not you found a way to look at kind of longitudinal results as to what happens with older adolescents when there's reports of neglect and the child welfare system doesn't respond, which seems to be the norm if I was understanding the slides correctly. I know from kind of smaller data sets that we had in the Bay Area, a lot of those kids seem like the costs are externalized from the child welfare system, and those kids are pushed into the homelessness system, the juvenile justice system, or sadly and unfortunately, we had a number of clients who died because the child welfare system didn't respond. So I'm curious as to that. And then the second one, I know you said you have plans to look at the source of referral. I'm interested specifically when the young person is the source of the referral themselves, because anecdotally that was so common, is young people who were experiencing homelessness who were calling child welfare to try to get help, and then the child welfare system not responding.
Yeah, I think that's the unfortunate thing that I kept saying when I was looking at this data, is that it seems like to me community members, or perhaps the child themselves, really have some concerns, some really serious concerns, and there's this perception that the Child Protective Service System is going to be able to do something about it or to give them some type of services, and that doesn't seem to be what's happening. Most of these don't, end up in any type of CPS intervention, and a lot don't even end up with a kind of a community-based service referral. So I think there's that kind of gap between how it's being viewed and how it actually is operating. And then the first question about following up with these kids, I would love to. And I have already started talking to Andy about how we could maybe think about doing that. Yeah, with different data, right? Like birth data or death data or juvenile justice data, and be able to kind of look a little bit forward.
So be sure and come back to next year's convening, or you'll get the follow-up to those questions.